Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second FEPS Employment Breakfast, where we'll dive into a key topic again on how to improve work and the world of work. Last week, we covered 0 unemployment territories. And this morning, we will look at workers' data rights. Why? Because, of course, we have seen a rapid digitalization of work, especially since COVID. And of course, this creates opportunities, but there's also quite a few risks when we think of, for instance, workers' data rights, but also their autonomy, for instance. We'll also be live for this breakfast session on YouTube, and it will also be recorded, so please be aware of that. For this session, I will not do it alone, luckily. So we have with us Joanna Bronowicka. She's a researcher at the European University of Viadrina, and she has closely followed issues around the digitalization of work. For instance, surveillance in the workplace. She's also investigated this to great detail and to my great interest. So I'm absolutely excited that she's here with us this morning. Now, for this session, what I want to do is the following. I will quickly, in about 12 minutes, lay out why I think that we need new institutional forms, new organizations, new forms of cooperation beyond the data protection authorities and unions, trade unions, to ensure that the digitalization of work aligns with workers' interests. And this is based on a paper that I wrote last year. We'll drop a link for you in the chat. Then Joanna Bronowicka will react to that with her own views, which I hope will not be too critical. No, I'm kidding. I expect a good discussion on this. And then afterwards, we still have a good 15 minutes at least for discussion, also for your questions. So please think of questions that you have during the seminar, and you can post them at the end. So that's it for now. So let me just go into my presentation. And I want to kick off with the question of why digitalization of work is an issue in the first place. Why have I focused on this? Why is this perhaps also a problem? Well, the past few years, as I already mentioned, especially since COVID, we've seen a rapid increase in algorithmic systems in the workplace. And of course, people know about surveillance and Amazon's, for instance, that workers are tracked to great detail in, for instance, warehouses. But this also has a much broader implementation. For instance, there's rating systems that measure workers' performance. Algorithmic systems are used to hire and fire people, to allocate work and tasks, and also to decide who gets promoted, for instance. And I think, and what I found out is that there's a real risk that this is kind of degenerating into, well, let's call it Taylorist hellscape, like a kind of micromanagement, deterministic systems that I think undermines workers' agency. I really think that the risk is that these algorithmic systems really leave little discretion and autonomy to workers, that they're also opaque and practically inscrutable. This is like the famous black box of algorithms that was all the rage a few years ago, but it's still very much a problem. And it also hides power relations at work. And management, they don't have to take accountability or responsibility for the decisions that they take if they can just kind of hide it in a system and pretend that nobody can change that. So I think it really changes the world of work in a very fundamental way. And my claim is that to counter this, workers need to effectively participate in the design of software, in the design of these systems. And I think that for that, we need new organizations. Often when I say that, people say, okay, I understand that this is perhaps a problem in the US, but in Europe, we have the GDPR, right? We have the General Data Protection Regulation, which comes up with a bunch of rights for workers. And those also relate to those systems, right? Because if you have an algorithmic system, so like an automated decision-making system in the workplace, it would often rely on personal data. So the General Data Protection Regulation applies. And that is, of course, true. But I also think that it doesn't offer the protection that some people think it does. And I'll explain you why. Because first of all, the GDPR is mainly focused on a set of individual rights. There are many useful rights. So the right to retrieve your data from a data controller, for instance, like your employer. Right to information about what kind of personal data is held about you, the reasons why you can erase that data. You can have the right to have like a human assessment instead of like a mechanic automated decision-making system. So that's all very useful, but it's also not so well suited to the workplace. Because of course in the workplace you have a hierarchical relationship between you and your employer, and a lot of the issues that will affect you are collective. Like if an algorithmic system based on personal data of you and all your colleagues comes up with a rating system, the question is not so much, yeah, can I get back my personal data, but why do we have this rating system? What kind of decisions, what kind of criteria does it use, etc. And also, of course, personal data in the workplace is often kind of shared data, right? When I send an email to a colleague, I can have access to the personal data, but that data also reveals stuff about my colleagues. So I think this is also a collective problem. And of course, to some extent, the GDPR recognizes this because in the law, it says that individual consent is not necessarily valid in a workplace context. But still, I think this is not the right framing for the discussion of software systems in the workplace. The second thing is that the GDPR is kind of defensively oriented. There are some exceptions, like the General Data Protection Impact Assessment, but in general, the GDPR is not really a governance system. So it's not a system where workers can co-decide like what technology operates in the workplace, how that's being used, but you more get a set of defensive rights, like to know what's being collected about you, how that's being collected, and then you can block that in certain instances. But that's very different from kind of like a cooperative, a collective way to decide how technology is used. So it has its limits. And finally, and this is very obvious now to most people working on this, is that the GDPR is not really enforced effectively, right? The data protection authorities, so those are the authorities that are responsible for making sure that the GDPR is implemented across the European territory, are kind of under-resourced in a very huge, very significant way. They have huge responsibilities under the law to make sure systems are legal, to do proactive investigations, to like scrutinize systems in all different sectors, handle complaints, do training activities and guidance, but they really can't do that. I think recent reports show that 9 DPAs out of 27 have less than 2 million euros budget. Actually, there's more than 27 because Germany has a decentralized system, but in any case, 9 DPAs have less than 2 million euros budget. And with that, they have to manage the entire digitalization of their societies, right? Also, better resource DPAs, like for instance in the Netherlands, already said in their own annual reports that effectively they will not comply with the legal obligations by simply not enforcing the law across huge swaths because they don't have the resources. The final thing here is that also I have the impression that DPAs are not really so much invested in the world of work. If you look at reports, for instance, of the European Data Protection Board, which is kind of the coordinating organism of the different DPAs, in the work plan of 2021 to 2022, employment is mentioned exactly 0 times. And this is in the year following the pandemic where everybody, well, quite a few people worked from home. So just to say that I think general data protection regulation is super useful. It's not that effective in really shaping the design of systems to comply or like to kind of align with work's interests. Then when I say that, people say yes, you mentioned that there's no governance system, but of course we do have that in the workplace. You know, it's collective labor, collective organization rights at work, right? Information rights, participation rights, co-decision rights. For instance, in Germany, works councils, that's kind of like the institution that arranges employee representation at the firm level. They have to be consulted on all new technologies that are implemented in the workplace. So that's quite a strong right on its face. However, at the moment, this doesn't look to be so effective because first of all, works councils are really uneven in their presence and their capacity across the European territories. So for instance, while in Germany, they're quite prevalent and they also have strong rights. This is much less so in Eastern Europe or for instance, in Southern Europe. Sometimes their rights are limited to information rights post facto. So the systems are already there, the investments have been made, and then the people are being informed about it. So you can't really do anything about it. So that's very ineffective. But even in Germany itself, which is kind of the paragon, often claimed to be the paragon of workers' co-determination and active influence over workplace decisions on technology, even in Germany, only 40% of employees in 2019 worked at firms where there was actually works council representation. That's a minority. So even in Germany itself, this will not be an effective solution for most workers. Finally, also, I want to say that intervening at the firm level via works councils is also difficult because for most bigger firms, the decisions are taken at the central level. So not at the firm level, but at the aggregate level, which could be in another country, for instance. And also that there has been a change in the software market, the enterprise software market. This is a bit what's called as a service, right? Software as a service, or the agile development, which means that software is kind of hosted centrally by a service provider, say Microsoft, and they kind of they allow firms to use the infrastructure, but the infrastructure is under the control of Microsoft. So if then at the works council level, you want to co-decide about technology being used, perhaps tweak it, that will be very difficult if even the firm doesn't control, if even your manager doesn't control how the software works and perhaps doesn't understand it, which seems to be the case. I mean, there's a lack of evidence on this, but initial reports seem to kind of show that there's really a lack of understanding also on the side of the management about the kind of technologies that they bring into the firm. Finally, I want to point out when we talk about works councils and unions, that unions are then often like expected to pick up the tab. So when there's no works councils, then unions can help workers to kind of look at the systems that are being implemented. But here we have similar problems in that unions' strength vary really across the European territories. It's about unionization rates, I think, are 2/3. It's like 60% or more in the Nordic countries. It's much lower in, for instance, Southern Europe. And also here, unions often lack the expertise as well, like technical and legal, to really look at these systems, audit algorithmic systems, but to really make a fist and kind of change the path, the development of these systems. So these are the problems. What, in my view, should we do about this? Well, I really think we should look at, like, seriously at the design of systems. And this is also something I said at the start, but I want to be a little bit more concrete now. I think that we really should heed, and this is really a cliche by now, but the idea that code is law, right? Like the famous dictum from law professor Lawrence Lessig, which he now came up with almost 20 years ago. But I still think we don't fully understand those implications. It means that a lot of regulation, a lot of the behavior of workers in the workplace is steered by the software, by the algorithms. They often determine what workers can and cannot do. They have certain scripts, so they make certain behavior more likely than others. And this is a huge power that kind of should also involve workers. And I also think that this design power, like these algorithms, often contradict legal requirements and workers' interests. And you can try to regulate that at a higher level, but that's very difficult to do, which we saw with the GDPR, right? The GDPR, for instance, contains the principle that that data should be minimized, right? You want to collect as few data, as little data as possible. But of course, the business interests are the exact opposite. And that's how they design the systems, to capture as much data as possible. And in that battle, it's very difficult for legal norms to win if they don't have a more direct impact on design. Now, my ideal solution would be for workers to effectively co-design systems that are used in the workplace. This may be a little bit utopian because, of course, they don't have the capacity to do that, and the software market is very centralized. But I do think there's practical things you can do. One way is, of course, to kind of like make the law more concrete. This is what's called law as code. You can use standards, certificates to operationalize legal requirements. For instance, the GDPR contains the idea of design by data protection by design and by default. That's very powerful, but it's not being implemented via standards or codes of conduct or certification mechanisms because businesses apparently don't really find it interesting to do so. So in that circumstance, what can we do? Well, I think that outside those formal processes of standardization, workers, but also academia could come together to kind of create their own certification scheme. If it's credible enough, and if enough users want to only buy products with that certificate, then you can get software designers, software firms also to cooperate. And this is not revolutionary. It has been tried in the past. For instance, the Swedish trade union did that effectively in the 80s. This was hardware. So they came up with a certification scheme for computer hardware called TCO that still exists and is very successful. And in essence, what they did is that they thought that computer monitors could be harmful for workers. So they got together with academia to evaluate those systems, also with workers, and then create certificates. if those systems complied with a certain quality criteria that would not harm workers, that would be not harmful for the eyes, then software providers would get that certificate. And software companies were also, hardware companies, sorry, were also eager to do that because the market was very competitive. They wanted to gain that edge. And I guess by that time, perhaps the market was also less globalized. So Sweden still played an important role here. And perhaps that's not anymore the case, or less so, because of course, the software market is very centralized. But so this really worked. In Sweden, they also tried to do it for software in the Users Award program, where they aim to do the same for software. So certifying software from a user perspective, including workers. This unfortunately never took off due to also a lack of cooperation from software companies who didn't see the interest in this. And perhaps by the time we're already so much consolidated that they didn't need to care. But I think it's really important to perhaps rekindle this type of thinking and to really think about if we can recreate some kind of institution like that, perhaps pan-European, because I have the impression that the software market is also quite centralized across different, like internationalized across different countries. This is really a very early stage proposal. And I think there's still a lot of hurdles ahead, which I'm pretty sure Joanna will probably also touch on. Because for instance, I need to know like how the software market looks like, how centralized, how concentrated it is, how standardized it is. Can it be tweaked at firm level? Is everything decided by a few large firms? Because if that's the case, then you probably need a really big scale also on the user side to kind of have meaningful impact. Also, the question is then kind of what do you want to look at? Because I don't think you can certify software in the abstract and then say, yeah, this is GDPR compliant, because a lot also depends on context. At the same time, I also think that some things you can see in the abstract. You can audit systems and see what the default settings are, which can be directly illegal and sometimes seem to be the case. You can look at how that's being licensed, if actually workers have an opportunity to even look how the system operates, how it functions, so if that's even legally possible. So I think you can say something in the abstract as well. And finally, you also have to think, of course, about organizational methods. One issue is, of course, the financing. I think if you really want to do certification, that's very intense. You need a lot of resources for that. And that probably also means business funding. But perhaps you could start with more an expert center where you kind of audit certain really commonly used systems. And then you probably can rely on leaner budgets with perhaps some public funding as well, perhaps some academic funding to get going, which is, I have the impression, also something that, for instance, Algorithm Watch does. So there's a lot of open questions still, but this is kind of the direction that I have the impression we should be going. And by now, I really think it's time to give the floor to Joanna to react to this. So I'm very much looking forward to that. Joanna, please, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome from Berlin, where it's a very rainy morning. Thank you, Justin, for this great presentation. I want to open with a general remark that I think beyond the few experts that are joining us today, the topic of the GDPR framework in the employment context is neglected. Of course, we have a lot of policy discussions looking forward to the future, and with the directive on the platform working conditions and with the AI Act, there's enough reflection about the role of technology in the workplace. But since I'm a researcher, I have to say, and I'm a sociologist, I have to say that we still lack the kind of diagnosis of what the situation is now and how these modern technologies really operate. We need more technical research, and how are they embedded in workplaces. And this is something that in the last couple of years of the enforcement of the GDPR, that's really missing for me. And also research about the reality, the everyday reality of filing complaints to the DPAs, everything, how it would really be for a worker to try to access their rights through the GDPR. I think that it's a pity because GDPR has a lot of potentials and gaps, and we're joined today also by Sig Silberman, who showed that Article 40 and the possibility of creating code of conduct is a great possibility. I saw that we're also joined by Hale van Abraha, who wrote a great report about one of the biggest downsides of the GDPR, which is the flexibility clause in Article 88 and the resulting regulatory diversity among the EU member states. And since I'm Polish, I can say that definitely our hope was that we're going to be using the GDPR for leveling up and for creating a European model of data protection. But that is constrained by the realities on the ground of the different institutional arrangements in different EU countries. So while I generally agree that the GDPR may be not fit for the purpose, as Hala van Abraham mentioned, and as Justin mentioned in their report, I do think that it provided at least some harmonization and some leveling up. And for what me is most interesting, it gave a new actor, a new institution, the DPA, a strong mandate to enter the field of employment. And I acknowledge that DPAs have a problem with resources, legitimacy, and interest, as it was put forward by Justin and Halefam. But I think that, for example, the recent decision of the Italian DPA to sanction Glovo, the platform company, with a very, very high fine of, I think, about 3 million euros, was a very interesting case study of how the DPAs could help workers and workers' rights in the ideal world. I mean, this was a momentous decision because it also showed that the DPAs can, with enough technical and legal expertise, sanction the use of sanction according to Article 22 of the GDPR, so protect workers from algorithmic decision-making. But it was also interesting because it showed that they can cooperate across borders. And I think that with a very high fine, they send a signal to the software developers and the platform companies. I think that that's the promise of the DPA and the GDPR model, which is that the decision in one country and that sanctions one company on one specific app, in this case, means that if they update the app, then the app is updated for all the other European Union countries and maybe even beyond EU. So this can have a really big positive impact on enforcement. I think what is really missing piece right now in the enforcement and debate is technical expertise. I think that's another interesting thing about the DPA decision, that they had access to technical evidence, not only because they asked the company for technical documentation, but also because basically they raided the office and used, they were accessing their software in real time to see what it actually does. This is a very rare case of access to understanding how these algorithmic systems actually work. And this type of research is definitely missing because we don't have collaboration from the companies. The companies are hiding behind trade secrets, and all the research that we do, or even legal decisions that are issued, are based on technical documentation. So to have a real look inside the algorithmic systems is very difficult. I personally worked with technical experts from the Tracking Exposed projects that designed a black box method, which allows you to kind of understand what data is used by these systems by looking at the inputs and the outputs of the software without necessarily having to look inside the algorithmic system. And I think that's very promising for type of research that doesn't require cooperation from the companies. But we really have to kind of find an answer to this key question of how we advance research on the technologies used in the workplace in order to move forward with our regulatory or institutional response. Now, concerning Justin's proposal, I think it's very timely and a great start for discussion. And why? I think it's because it forces us to think about beyond the DPAs, as I mentioned, and beyond workers' representatives as the only actors in the enforcement and the co-design of technologies. I think the trade unions are increasingly willing and able to play a crucial role. but it's simply impossible to rely on them in countries where collective bargaining is weak or absent. And we need to also acknowledge that this vacuum has been filled by civil society actors, some old actors, for example, the Panopticon Foundation from Warsaw, but also some newer initiatives like the Worker Exchange Info, Worker Observatory, Tracking Exposed Project, and they have kind of taken a role of the workers' representatives because they have the technical expertise that is necessary to do so in the modern workplace. But they do have different scopes and different strengths, and the resulting response is rather fragmented and reactive. As Justin mentioned, I think we need to think of a new actor that would be specialized in workers' rights, but would be more proactive and already provide some support and at the level of implementing company. I must apologize, but I think I need to just turn in my charging because I forgot to charge my phone. Okay, sorry. So just to wrap up, I think that the vacuum that is currently interested in needs to be filled. So I think Justin now defined the mission of this organization as some kind of certifications and auditing of software systems. I think that's a very narrow mission. I think we need to think of like 3 functional layers that need to be filled up. First, as I already mentioned, is the research on the enforcement practices, but also on the software market, but also on the relationship that happens in the humans and software in the workplace, because it's not software alone that violates data protection rights. It's the management systems that involve humans and their decisions. And we know very little about this. So I think that's one function that is, that's institutional function that's missing. The second one is the kind of guidelines for software makers and companies purchasing them on how to do things right. There has been a lot of work on different principles, criteria, standards, and how to, in general, in abstract terms, give guidance to software makers. But I think that we need to find the actors either on the software market or on the companies that want to collaborate and really show how to be a role model in the field. And finally, auditing and certification, as Justin mentioned, I think that this could work, but we need more good practices from other sectors and more research to define how to do it in a way to really create incentives and competitive advantages for companies so they would be interested in participating. So I think these are the 3 kind of institutional functional areas where there's an institutional vacuum. And I think Justin proposes a new institution, possibly with public funding or management. I think that would be great because it would tie experts on the European level, which there are many, but not many can work on this full time. But I think that there's room for discussion, and I'm definitely looking forward to that at what could be a design of such institution. Maybe that doesn't have to be a public actor, but a bottom-up initiative like a think tank or an NGO, or some kind of coalition of actors. And I think the most important question is how would it fit in this context of regulatory diversity across the EU and the various institutional arrangements that we have in different countries. So maybe not a new actor, but for example, we need to provide better resources and funding for the existing actors. For example, we could think of a way to give more resources and legitimacy and interest to the DPAs who could play a more active role in the enforcement in the employment context. So this is my reaction, and I'm looking forward to your contributions and your questions.
All right, thanks a lot, Joanna. Perhaps a quick response from my side. I fully agree, right? With practically everything you said. So I think you mentioned that research is really important. That is kind of a precondition because there's a lot unknown, and I fully agree. So the study that we did, like we didn't come up with like a lot of new data, but really looked at what's out there, and it's very, very scarce, especially in Europe, about what's being done in the workplace. But the little that is there indeed points to kind of severe problems. So illegal systems, workers and managements having no clue about their rights or legal obligations. Well, you know this better than I do because you were involved in some of that research. So I fully agree that this should be the starting point. And we're also kind of at FEPS, we're looking into that. So we're starting something like that in the Nordic countries in next year. Then on the GDPR, I was perhaps a bit critical because I tried to make the point that we need new institutions. But of course, I think the GDPR is still very important. And there's also a lot that we probably can do with the GDPR, right? I mean, you mentioned this Glovo decision, which was very impactful. And a lot of people didn't think it was possible that those kind of like automated, like Article 22, or this Article 22, I think, about fully automated decision making, etc., that they were kind of like a dead letter and they couldn't be used, and that's just incorrect. So there's a lot of scope to take those actions, to go to court, to test what's possible, and I think a lot of the like legal potential of the GDPR really hasn't been explored. And I also think that, and I also put in my report that the GDPR enforcement side has a lot of like low-hanging fruit that can still be improved. Like we had a look at a case in Germany, Zalando, which was kind of crazy, where the DPA spent a lot of resources looking into like an algorithmic system for rating workers at Zalando. That turned out to be illegal. It took a lot of resources, 1.5 years or 2 years or something, before the DPA kind of like came up with a decision. That decision was closed door. I'm not even sure if it was a decision, but they gave some private guidance to Zalando, no fine. So the effect of that is super limited. Other companies don't even know like how to improve their systems because that's not even public. There's no fine, so there's no dissuasive effect. But there's a lot of that stuff that you can easily change. And I think it's also now happening because I think DPAs are getting a lot of criticism and a lot of flack for this. So I think the attitudes are also starting to change, and I think that's a very good thing. I think also that that there's some institutional like design things you can do, right? Because now, for instance, there's no database of like decisions from DPAs that affect workers, which I think would also be really helpful for DPAs, like, you know, in different countries to know what the others are doing. Also because like a lot of those firms, of course, operate cross-border. So there, I think I'm definitely agreeing that a lot can be done. You also mentioned certification, and I see indeed that also code of conducts and certification linked to the GDPR. And I also see that Michael Six-Silberman is here. And I read the report that you did on that. I think that's very interesting. At the same time, I also think that like I try to look what's being done, but it's almost nothing, right? It's if you look at the like the systems for code of conduct and certification on the GDPR, and apparently they have to be listed on the website of the European Data Protection Board. There's almost nothing apparently that is being done, and you need business cooperation. And I have the feeling that right now a lot of businesses also like this kind of like unclear legal context where it's just not clear when you are complying with the law and where you're not. And when you really come up with a clear code of conduct, then a lot of people will have to change their existing practices. So so I feel that there's a big hurdle there if you want to kind of follow the institutional path under the GDPR when you talk about certification and codes of conduct. In the meantime, I'm on interrupt my ramblings because I see that there's a question from Eamon Noonan. He says that he believes that some Nordic universities have imposed their own stipulations on PC suppliers to ensure compliance with relevant rules and norms. Has this been studied? Is there any evidence of public bodies more widely taking this approach? Shouldn't they be expected or obliged to do so? That's very interesting, to be honest. I don't know. I expect to find this out in the coming 2 years, where we do kind of a big research project, especially in the Nordics on this. I do think that what you're saying is probably like public procurement side stuff. So it's like norms in public procurement. So if you use software, then those suppliers will have to, you know, come up with certain norms, or hardware, they have to abide by certain norms. I think on the EU law that is possible. So like EU public procurement law says that you can come up with your own requirements, like social requirements. So for instance, that companies have like collective agreements in place, all that stuff. You can do that. You can also have like environmental norms in there. I'm sure that this would also be possible to do in the rules. and GDPR, of course. I mean, that should be legal in any case, but that they have some kind of a clear code of conduct. I think you can do that. I also think that when you talk about public procurement, it's often very difficult because a lot of municipalities are, again, understaffed on the resource. So it's one individual person sitting at a desk. And when you talk about public procurement, it's often cheapest to just go for, it's safest to go for the big suppliers, the cheapest option. If you want to come up with social criteria, you're subject to legal action as well. So it's a kind of a risk. So I think it's difficult to do if there's not clear guidelines. So this is something that also Joanna mentioned. So there's a lack of guidelines on this. So what kind of rules would such software systems would have to comply with? So I think this is very interesting. I'll definitely look into that. Then we have, by the way, Joanna, I'm rambling, but if you have reactions to this or you want to come in on this, then please do so. Then there's another observation from Michael. Oh, Mikael, perhaps, if I guess you're German. So there's a major enforcement deficit. And he mentioned that it would be exciting to also discuss strategic enforcement. So I guess that means like focusing on the big cases. I think that's, I mean, Joanna, you can come in on this, but I guess that that the global example would be a good case of that, right?
Yeah, I think strategic enforcement is very interesting, but there is like a missing step right before that is how do we get a wind of information about problems? And I think we have to really encourage different actors to collect evidence from the workplace, even as fragmented as it is. Maybe it doesn't have to be a research project, but we can encourage existing our formal trade unions or even informal collectives to collect information how this algorithmic management things work. And we have very good examples of how that can be done by writers in the platform economy, but we have even very little anecdotal evidence of how it works, for example, in other types of companies, in more white collar professions. We have to kind of start a discussion and engage workers themselves and their representatives in trying to sort of they cannot open the black box, but they can tell us more real life stories of when and how they feel their rights are violated. We need to have this discussion on a much more mainstream level, because the next step would be them trying to access their rights through the GDPR and filing an official complaint to their national DPA. And I think one of the EDRI, civil society organizations, noticed how also the diversity of complaint procedures across Europe is a challenge. In Italy, for example, it is possible also not to be the subject that's concerned with the violation, but just somebody who notices violation to file a complaint, but that's not always the case. So I think in order to, we also have to fix the strategic enforcement by trying to get more cases, even more failed cases, because we can also learn from the failures of these complaints and negative DPA decisions or negative court decisions, because of course there's another actor that we're not mentioning here, which are the courts that have played a major role in defining the law. But this all depends on, sort of a massive, maybe a social movement of people that care about digital rights at the same time as they care about labor rights. And I think there is hope there, because the new generation, we're getting signals that they're not also more digitally savvy, but there is some kind of renewed interest in labor rights. So we need to really also use our educational institution, universities, to create people that will, be that kind of activist that wants to do this strategic enforcement, or to join this institution that you're proposing, because it's a very complicated mix of skills that I think is possible to achieve, but it's, a very high level of technical expertise and legal expertise. We need to make people feel more comfortable in this field and confident, because I think people actually do get it, but it's somehow portrayed in a way as impenetrable topic, and it's not. Everybody can understand the principle of data minimization, or that you should delete data that you don't need. We have to start talking also in simpler terms about these things.
Thanks a lot, Joanna. Really good points. And I think that's exactly the challenge. That's the challenge. I see it in my broader also in the digital portfolio, like to connect like the technical people to the people who care, like about their specific workday circumstances that they have to face. So you have to build this broad movement. And you always see like there's a lot of technical experts that are kind of on the separate track, and to connect that to the broader public debate is a big challenge. But I think that's like kind of the precondition for kind of doing the stuff that I like to do, which is perhaps again a bit technocratic, but to build those institutions. I think that I want to build the institutions has to do with the fact that like I worked in the commission and I see that more and more authority of the law is kind of devolved to standards, guidelines, certification systems and stuff. And so I think it's really important that we don't forget.
Well, because I think we forget, and I was at the Ministry of Digitalization in Poland where we were consulting on GDPR. We forget that GDPR was not conceived only to protect rights, consumer rights and workers' rights in this case. The GDPR was actually also supposed to create a European way of making business, which would make somehow software makers be interested in being compatible with human rights and create, European model, European products that then the rest of the world would be interested in buying. And I think your proposal, it's very social democrat proposal in terms of, believing that institutions can especially state institution can be the answer. But on the other hand, it's a proposal that really takes into account the fact that there might be interest from the software makers or from companies in exactly compliance for kind of signaling, virtue signaling, showing, okay, we're doing this thing is right. And, the job market in certain sectors can be very, competitive, as in it's hard to find talent. So I think we have to kind of work in this direction to show that companies can be friendly to workers, and that being friendly to workers is not only offering mental health services, but also giving some kind of say in how software is used and how their data is protected. So I think that was a promise, to raise the standards together with the private sector. In that sense, it's maybe also interesting for people with other political options.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with that. I see also that we kind of came to the end of this. I mean, there's still a lot I want to say also about the decentralization and bottom-up approaches that you mentioned, because for me that feels necessary. So I'm not like a big state social democrat that I think the state should do everything. And I also work there, so I definitely am familiar with the limitations of that type of approach. At the same time, for me, it's when I talk to stakeholders at European level, they say that the software market is so concentrated and those people are so powerful that I also feel there's kind of a mismatch between those approaches. So like, I think you need some type of buy-in as well from some kind of bigger players to get something done. And perhaps those are European players that they kind of want to play by European rules. I don't know. But I think, yeah, this requires a smart coalition building as well. Anyway, I want to close it off here. I want to really thank the audience. And of course, especially I want to thank you, Joanna, for those really good insights. And I'll also really take that with me for the design of the research project here at FEPS in the coming 2 years. Well, we'll be looking exactly at these types of issues and how to do it best. And what I really take home is like, not to take a too technocratic approach, but really also first kick off this discussion and kind of get some baseline data on what is actually happening at the workplace, for instance. Like how do people experience digitalization? So kind of like more and not immediately start with like, we should build this institution in these lines. So perhaps we should take a little bit more time as well there. So I have my work cut out for me. Thanks a lot. Thanks again to the audience. And
thank you, Justin.
Yeah, I also want to say, if people are interested in this or you have good contacts, good ideas, please reach out to me. You can find my email on the website. And final note, we have a series of policy breakfasts. So this was the second one. We have another one this Thursday, which has to do with skills for a green recovery. And then next week, we have our last employment breakfast where we look at gender equalities in the labor market. So if you find it interesting, please join those discussions as well. Same time, same format. Thanks again, and looking forward to meeting you also in the future on these topics and to connecting again.